Afternoon, everybody. I don't mean to turn my blog into some sort of rant in a car type thing. I thought I'd share a few words on current events. You hear a lot of language right now in the media, particularly coming out of the Trump administration. A lot of people on the right referring to left extremism, which I find rather a little more amusing and insulting, considering that they think the Democrats are going further left and all this kind of thing, in my opinion, as they should. But there is no legitimate representation of leftist views in American politics that was effectively washed out and pushed out, stronghold out, if you will, in the McCarthy era. What followed there was, if you read Rotary's book about the new left, there's really no legitimate party in American politics right now that is actively working for what I would consider leftist ideology, progressive or socially progressive anyway, that doesn't involve some sort of authoritarian plan for action, with some sort of centralized government answering the problem. Kind of where I feel like you're no longer sort of representing the left that I personally and people I know personally, and what I would consider true leftism to be what it ought to be anyway. It should always be in the hands of the people, and it should always be in the minds of the people, controlled and driven by the people. Any top-down efforts made, I feel, should always be in a supportive effort, devising laws or instituting some sort of government aid to marginalized communities. It's more or less developing programs and services that provide access. And that's different than what people on the right would consider a welfare type of state action. Malcolm X so eloquently observed in his book was something that, was devised out of the white supremacy to make marginalized communities dependent on a system that cared very little about their welfare to begin with. If you read his book and if you agree with that, you can clearly see how that could be undermining to any real revolutionary change later on down the road. Problem with putting your dependence in a centralized government body is that you leave yourself open to remaining dependent on it almost indefinitely. And that is a principle that I kind of have to acknowledge. It's a thing. So what's the solution? Well, I don't have a solution for you today, but I do have some ideas. My ideas generally center around empowerment as opposed to enablement. It centers around grassroots efforts and a complete shift and change in not just the mindset of those that are in conflict with any sort of ideas or notions about what we should be paying our taxes to, welfare type of stuff, and government policies that protect the environment, or taxes to national defense and enabling corporations to do the things that they do, both of which, in my opinion, are very detrimental to personal liberties, but more importantly, they are detrimental to communal liberties. And what I mean by that is that they can more easily squash revolutionary changes coming out of communities that have historically been marginalized, such as the black community, the indigenous community, and so forth. I wanted to address the whole notion of the Arm Leftist blog as it stands as a functioning political sort of think tank, at least for me anyway. It's sort of where I come to kind of process this stuff and put it out there. I want to make it clear that sometimes I don't feel good about picking a side type of thing, and I'm not necessarily saying that that's a good or a bad thing, but for me it just sort of feels like it could be very limiting in one's ability to kind of understand and perceive, your opponent's arguments. The reason why I chose to call my blog The Arm Leftist was for a number of reasons. And the number one reason to antagonize thought is to antagonize the left, people, comrades on the left, myself, green leftists, green anarcho leftists, to antagonize their ideologies about being armed. And being armed in a number of ways. Being armed with knowledge, proper knowledge, being armed with proper arguments that aren't straw man, that aren't wooden leg, that aren't any of those logical fallacy ones that you always run into, that you see coming out of the right and the left. Having proper arguments, not just academically based and logically based, but more or less you're armed with facts so that you can, confront those counter arguments and think logically about them and think critically about them. Number two, of course, being actually armed. One of the things about the left that has always been troubling to me was this sort of readiness to give their rights to protect themselves over to the government. And if you think about that, you're talking about the police and you're talking about the military. You're talking about a police state. You're talking about martial law and all that kind of business. That's something I just can't have. I just can't get behind. It's been demonstrated for decades. The police have violently oppressed, patrolled, and occupied the black community, the indigenous community, the so-called Latino, Hispanic community, and other non-white communities. And that's a big problem. Any sort of institutionalized government control of weapons is another form of white supremacy, just like welfare can be and has been and is demonstrated to be for the last 50 years. If you do the research and you really critically think about, I'm not against welfare, I'm just against the idea of instituting welfare without eliminating the white supremacy. It's sort of like having diversity. You can have diversity, but without eliminating the white supremacy, it's still white supremacy. You just have black stormtroopers. You have Hispanic people that, bang for Trump, that kind of thing. You got to get rid of the white supremacy, because otherwise none of that stuff is meaningful in any sort of way, and it doesn't liberate anything. I also want to antagonize the right, and in that way, letting them know. The idea of the arm leftists is to antagonize the right and the left. I've already said how I want to antagonize the comrades on the left. I antagonize my opponents on the right is to inform them and let them know that we're not just sissified tree huggers, that we're critically thinking people, that we're caring people, that we're moral people, and that we are interested in the truth, and we are interested in a solution that is inclusive. Because the solutions I see coming out of the left, I don't see the solutions that I agree with. I see solutions coming out of the left that are authoritarian based. I see the same thing on the right. The thing is that now, especially with the introduction of Trumpism, and I'm going to say it, I'm going to call it as Trumpism, because it's the reintroduction of brutal application of exclusivity and this brutal insistence on nationalism, specifically white nationalism. And I mean that, because when they say American and they mean all that, think about what they're talking about. Think about what they're referring to, okay? They're not referring to anybody that's culturally, affiliated with their Mexican culture, or their Filipino culture, or their Chinese culture. They want somebody that's culturally an American, that's been whitewashed and cleansed of any of those things. Again, you can't have nationalism unless you get rid of the white supremacy. So long as that white supremacy is over there like that as an umbrella, as it has been established in our history, white nationalism is going to function like that too. Their solutions, I think that what I see is I think they see themselves as morally correct, and they believe that they are. I'm just saying that they're unequivocally and absolutely incorrect about a lot of things, and I absolutely totally disagree with the methods that they're using. It's very authoritarian. It's very brutal. Trump means at least for me, politically on the right, from my perspective, it means a reintroduction of severe and deep sadistic ideologies. That sadistic approach to things, that sadistic perception of people, migrants, for instance, so-called illegals and all this kind of business, is why we have these guys on the border patrolling and taking groups of people and keeping them under armed guard and placing them under arrest, citizens arrest, all this kind of business. But I want to antagonize the right to know that they're not dealing with what they would consider so-called leftists. I don't think they know what that means. I think when they point their finger at liberals, they think they're pointing their finger at leftists. Liberals are centralist. They almost always have been centralist. They always please both sides of the aisle. That's why nobody likes them. That's why Malcolm X complained about them. That's why even Martin Luther King complained about them. A lot of people complained about them. A lot of revolutionary people complained about them. A lot of Black Panthers complained about them. They still complain about them because of the centralist type of thing. That's not a leftist. A liberal is not a leftist. Well, I had a visit. Actually, my family had a visit from somebody who called themselves a representative of the Republican Party of Utah. Unfortunately, my wife didn't get his name, but I had her meet him at the door when he came to our house one Saturday, bearing pamphlets, propaganda of sorts. He came to our house because he saw our Black Lives Matter sign, and he wanted to remind us that all lives matter. My wife, most appropriately, disagreed with him and said, well, when the police stop targeting young black men disproportionately, until then, I'm going to keep my sign up. They had at least a 20-minute discussion on our front steps, of which I did not participate in because it didn't feel like I would be as diplomatic and as kind as my lovely wife was. He left us with a piece of propaganda which he said that he would return for. He has yet to return for it, but my suspicion is that he was dispatched by someone in our neighborhood to come talk to us about our sign. Our sign is still up, and Black lives still matter regardless of whether we'll have our sign up, but we're keeping it up for that particular purpose. And remember, when I mean to antagonize somebody, I mean to antagonize their thoughts. I mean to antagonize them to think about their position on something such as police brutality. And it isn't meant to troll somebody. It's meant to get them to think, to antagonize their critical thinking. This man obviously wasn't of that persuasion. He just wanted to come and try and persuade us to take down our sign. And my sense is that when he returns, he will return with other people. At which point, I'm not having it. I'm not having it. Like I said, the Arm Leftist is meant to antagonize thought. It's meant to antagonize critical thinking. Again, to recap, the main point is any political movement that you're involved in, right, left, left of center, right of center, centralist, anything like that. I got a vegan straight edge, representation here. If it doesn't involve some sort of anti-racism, anti-fascism, some sort of anti-authoritarianism, some sort of way that approaches the liberation of the working class and the poor, it's not revolutionary, and it can lead to even more subjugation and oppression of, particularly of communities that historically have been targeted for such. What that means is that it's meaningless without it. You can have all kinds of wonderful changes, but if you don't get rid of that overarching white supremacy, it's not going to mean much. And it's just gonna whitewash it and paint it differently. You're just covering it up with something else. It needs to be rooted out at the roots. It needs to be gone forever. Fascism, white supremacy, need to be smashed on sight, man. And that's just how it is. If anything is going to be real change, any sort of real social change, political change, and there needs to be some real legitimate representation of the left in our political world. Presently, there isn't one. There are a few politicians that are kind of making noise. Don't believe the hype, man. It's still a thing. Keep it real, and Watch out for your communities. Watch out for yourselves. Stay strapped. And peace and love.